January 1943. The island air is heavy with salt and decay. Palm fronds hang torn and blackened, their edges burned by artillery blast. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the ocean breathes slowly, indifferent. A Japanese staff officer stands over a crude map table. The paper is damp, ink has bled into the fibers. Red pencil marks indicate enemy positions, small arrows pushing inland from the beach. They are labeled simply Kaigun Hashiden, U.S. Marines. For months, Imperial headquarters had spoken of Americans as undisciplined. Industrial soldiers, soft men dependent on machines. They were expected to break once the landing craft burned. But the reports arriving from the front say something else. The Marines did not stop advancing after the first counterattack. They did not retreat when cut off at night. They moved forward in small groups, silently, methodically, dragging their wounded with them. They returned fire with unnerving precision. One report notes something unusual. The Marines kept coming even after officers fell. There was no pause, no hesitation. The officer exhales slowly. This enemy does not behave as expected. And with that realization, a deeper question begins to form. What did Japanese commanders truly think when they finally faced U.S. Marines in battle? Long before the first U.S. Marines set foot on a Pacific island, the Imperial Japanese military had already formed an opinion about the kind of enemy it would face. That opinion was shaped by history, ideology, and experience, but not by direct confrontation. By the late 1930s, Japan's armed forces were deeply confident in their understanding of war. They had been fighting continuously on the Asian mainland since 1931. In Manchuria, in Shanghai, across the vast interior of China. These were brutal campaigns, fought against opponents who were often poorly equipped, fragmented, and lacking unified command. Victory, though costly, had reinforced a dangerous assumption. Spirit outweighed material, and discipline defeated numbers. At the heart of this belief stood Bushido, the warrior code adapted by the modern imperial army and navy. It emphasized obedience, sacrifice, and death before surrender. Officers were taught that morale and willpower could overcome artillery, air power, and even encirclement. The individual soldier was expected to endure any hardship without complaint. This doctrine shaped how Japanese commanders evaluated foreign armies. Western militaries, particularly those of the United States, were viewed through a lens of cultural prejudice and selective intelligence. American society was seen as wealthy, comfortable, and soft. Its soldiers, Japanese analysts believed, would lack endurance and spiritual resolve. Training manuals and intelligence summaries frequently described Americans as physically large but mentally weak, dependent on supply lines, machinery, and overwhelming firepower. The U.S. Marine Corps, specifically, was poorly understood. Before 1941, Japanese naval intelligence classified Marines largely as shipboard infantry, useful for guarding bases, but not exceptional in offensive land combat. The Corps, interwar development of amphibious doctrine, combined arms coordination, and decentralized leadership went almost entirely unrecognized. Japanese planners did not ignore the United States entirely. War colleges studied American industrial capacity and naval construction. They understood that America could build ships and aircraft at astonishing speed. But this only reinforced another assumption. Americans would rely on machines to compensate for weak fighting spirit. The Japanese solution was decisive battle. If the U.S. Navy could be drawn across the Pacific and shattered in one overwhelming engagement, American morale would collapse. The public would demand peace. The war would end before industrial advantage could matter. This logic guided Japan's opening moves. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Guam. Wake Island. In the first 6 months of war, Japanese forces advanced with breathtaking speed. Allied positions crumbled. Prisoners were taken in vast numbers. The narrative of Western weakness seemed confirmed. But there was an exception. At Wake Island in December 1941, a small Marine garrison resisted repeated assaults. Japanese landing forces were repelled. Aircraft were shot down. Ships were damaged. The island eventually fell, but not before inflicting unexpected losses. To Tokyo, Wake was dismissed as an anomaly. The real test, commanders believed, would come later, when American forces were exhausted, far from home, and forced into decisive confrontation under Japanese terms. Yet beneath the confidence, a contradiction was already forming. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive night attacks, close combat, and infiltration. These methods had worked well in China and early Pacific engagements, but they relied on an enemy that panicked under pressure. What if the enemy did not panic? What if discipline was not exclusive to Japan? As 1942 unfolded and American counteroffensives began to appear on the horizon, Japanese intelligence officers started gathering new reports that did not align with pre-war assumptions. They spoke of Marines who dug in quickly, who coordinated fire with naval guns offshore, who adapted rapidly under fire. At first, these accounts were treated cautiously. Field reports could exaggerate, defeats bred excuses. But soon the volume increased. And by the summer of 1942, Japanese commanders would be forced to confront the reality they had not prepared for, an enemy whose behavior did not match the image crafted in Tokyo. That realization would fully take shape on a remote, jungle-covered island in the southern Solomons. August 7, 1942. The morning sky over the Solomon Islands is pale and still. From the decks of Japanese patrol vessels and coastal observation posts, unfamiliar shapes appear on the horizon, dozens of ships moving with deliberate order. This is no raid, no diversion, it is an invasion. For the first time in the Pacific War, Imperial Japanese forces are about to face a large-scale, coordinated American amphibious landing. The target is Guadalcanal, a remote island whose value lies in a single unfinished airstrip carved from jungle and coral. The troops coming ashore are U.S. Marines. Japanese commanders are caught off guard but not unprepared. They expect the Americans to secure the beaches and hesitate. They assume counterattacks, especially at night, will break cohesion and morale. These assumptions are grounded in experience and in doctrine. What unfolds instead unsettles them. Within hours, the Marines establish defensive perimeters. Engineers begin improving the airstrip, later named Henderson Field. Artillery is emplaced. Supply dumps are organized. Patrols push outward into the jungle with discipline and caution. The Japanese response is immediate and violent. Small units attack at night, screaming charges intended to shock and disorient. In previous campaigns, such tactics often shattered defenders. On Guadalcanal, they meet concentrated rifle fire, machine guns, flares, and pre-registered artillery. The Marines hold. Japanese after-action reports begin to note something unusual. American units do not collapse when officers are killed. Non-commissioned officers take over without visible disruption. Fire continues. Lines remain intact. This is not the behavior Japanese doctrine had predicted. As the campaign drags on, the observations grow sharper. Marines rotate units in and out of the line. Wounded are evacuated under fire. Supply shortages are endured without disorder. Even during the desperate early weeks, when the U.S. Navy withdraws and Marines are temporarily isolated, the expected psychological breaking point never comes. One Japanese intelligence officer writes that the enemy fights with organization rather than passion. The phrasing is revealing. passion, sation, was supposed to be Japan's advantage, organization the Americans' crutch. But here, organization is proving decisive. Similar patterns appear elsewhere. On Chalagi, Marines clear entrenched Japanese defenders with methodical brutality. Grenades are followed by rifle fire, then immediate consolidation. There is no pause to celebrate. Each position is treated as a temporary step forward. At Cape Gloucester, later in the war, Japanese troops will describe Marines advancing through swamp and rain with mechanical persistence, slow, unstoppable, immune to intimidation. The Japanese command structure struggles to interpret this enemy. Some officers argue that Marines are elite troops, not representative of the broader American Army. Others suggest that naval gunfire and air support are masking American weaknesses, but frontline commanders are less convinced. They see Marines operating in small, flexible units. Squad leaders make independent decisions. Fire teams maneuver without waiting for orders from above. This decentralization contradicts Japanese expectations of rigid Western command. More troubling is the Marines' relationship with firepower. Japanese soldiers are trained to close with the enemy, believing proximity favors spirit. Marines, by contrast, maintain distance when advantageous, using coordinated fire to grind down attackers before close combat occurs. When Marines do close, it is deliberate and overwhelming. There is no theatrical charge, no shouted defiance. Just movement, fire, advance. As weeks turn into months, Guadalcanal becomes a slow, grinding battle of attrition, something Japanese planners had sought to avoid at all costs. The island consumes men, ships, aircraft, and morale. And it forces a painful reassessment. The Americans, particularly the Marines, are not fighting as amateurs or industrial automatons. They are learning, adapting, improving faster than expected. By early 1943, Japanese High Command quietly revises its internal assessments. Marines are no longer described merely as auxiliary infantry. They are recognized as shock troops trained for sustained combat under extreme conditions. The realization does not come with public acknowledgement. Pride and ideology prevent that. But in private memoranda, in field diaries, and in the tone of operational planning, the shift is unmistakable. The enemy has a face now. And as Japanese commanders begin to study that face more closely, they do so from several different perspectives, each revealing a deeper understanding of who the U.S. Marines truly are. Angle 1: Tactical shock. The first and most immediate reaction among Japanese commanders was tactical. They had expected the Marines to fight like a conventional Western force, centralized, slow to react, dependent on rigid chains of command. Instead, they encountered a battlefield system built around small unit initiative. Japanese reports from Guadalcanal and later New Guinea describe Marine squads that maneuvered independently, often without visible direction from higher headquarters. Fire teams advanced while others provided covering fire. When one element was pinned down, another shifted position without waiting for orders. This behavior was deeply unsettling. Imperial doctrine emphasized obedience and cohesion at the unit level, but decision-making remained concentrated among officers. When leaders were killed, units often stalled or dissolved. Marines did not. Japanese officers began noting that Marine non-commissioned officers, sergeants and corporals, exercised authority with confidence. They adjusted fire, repositioned men, continued attacks without interruption. This adaptability blunted Japan's preferred tactics. Night infiltration, once a decisive weapon, lost its shock value. Marines employed flares, tripwires, overlapping fields of fire, and prearranged artillery responses. Attacks were anticipated, not feared. In several engagements, Japanese units reported being cut down before closing to bayonet range, a devastating psychological blow to soldiers trained to believe the final charge was decisive. The Marines were not simply reacting, they were controlling the tempo of battle. Angle 2. Psychological impact. Perhaps more disturbing than Marine tactics was their psychological resilience. Japanese military culture placed immense emphasis on the breaking point, on the moment when fear overcame discipline. Commanders expected American units to retreat under sustained pressure, especially at night. But Marines did not retreat easily. They endured bombardment, they endured isolation, they endured heat, disease, and supply shortages, and still they held their ground. Japanese soldiers wrote of Marines who continued firing even when wounded, of positions that had to be destroyed completely before resistance ceased. The absence of surrender was particularly alarming. In imperial doctrine, surrender was shameful, but it was also rare. To encounter an enemy who shared this trait, without sharing Japan's ideology, created confusion. Some officers interpreted this as stubbornness, others as indoctrination. A few began to suspect something deeper, a professional identity rooted not in honor or emperor, but in collective responsibility. Marines fought for each other. This observation appears repeatedly in Japanese accounts. Marines recovered their wounded under fire. They refused to abandon bodies. They returned to lost ground not for glory, but to restore unit integrity. For Japanese commanders accustomed to exploiting fear, this emotional cohesion was difficult to counter, and it forced them to reconsider what truly sustained an army in prolonged combat. Angle 3. Technology and coordination. While ideology clashed on the ground, another realization emerged above it. The Marines were never alone. Japanese commanders quickly recognized that Marine effectiveness was amplified by coordination with naval and air forces. Artillery fire was accurate and responsive. Naval gunfire adjusted rapidly based on ground observation. Air support appeared with increasing precision. This was not random firepower. It was a system. Marines marked targets. Radios crackled constantly. Requests for fire were met within minutes. Positions thought secure were shattered by shells from unseen ships beyond the horizon. Japanese defenses, often static and lightly supplied, struggled to survive under this integrated assault. The implication was unsettling. Even when Marines appeared isolated, they were connected to ships, aircraft, and logistics chains that Japan could not match indefinitely. By late 1943, Japanese commanders no longer viewed Marine units in isolation. They saw them as the forward edge of an enormous, coordinated machine, one that learned, adapted, and corrected its mistakes faster with each battle. And yet, for all this analysis, one critical question remained unresolved within Japanese command circles. Was this effectiveness the result of technology alone, or something deeper, rooted in leadership and belief? That question would shape the next phase of Japanese understanding. Angle 4. Leadership perception. As battles accumulated and casualty lists lengthened, Japanese commanders began paying closer attention to how U.S. Marines were led. What they observed challenged long-held assumptions. Marine officers were often seen close to the front, not as distant figures issuing orders from rear positions, but as participants in the fight, moving between squads, coordinating fire, exposing themselves to the same dangers as enlisted men. This visibility mattered. Japanese field reports note that Marine units did not disintegrate when officers fell. Authority passed seamlessly to the next leader. Orders continued. Attacks resumed. The chain did not break, it flexed. For Japanese commanders trained in a more hierarchical tradition, this adaptability was unsettling. Leadership in the imperial forces carried near-absolute authority, but it also created vulnerability. When leadership was removed, cohesion often collapsed. Marine leadership, by contrast, appeared distributed. Some Japanese officers quietly acknowledged this as a strength. Others dismissed it as recklessness. But the evidence mounted. Decentralized leadership allowed Marines to fight effectively even in chaos. In private assessments, several Japanese officers concluded that Marine leadership produced soldiers who trusted their commanders, not because of rank or ritual, but because of shared hardship and competence. This realization struck at the core of imperial military identity. Angle 5. Ideological conflict. Beyond tactics and leadership lay a deeper conflict, one of belief. Japanese commanders had been taught that spiritual superiority would decide battles. That devotion to the emperor and willingness to die would overwhelm any materially superior enemy. The Marines complicated this worldview. They did not fight for an emperor. They did not shout ideological slogans. They did not seek death. And yet they did not fear it. Japanese observers struggled to categorize this mindset. Marines showed determination without ritual, discipline without rigid ceremony, courage without the language of sacrifice. Some Japanese officers described Marines as emotionless in battle, not because they lacked feeling, but because they did not display it in expected ways. There was no dramatic flourish, no visible spiritual climax. Just persistence. This forced Japanese commanders to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that modern warfare might reward professionalism over ideology, training over belief, cohesion over symbolism. For an army built on spiritual absolutism, this was a destabilizing thought. Angle 6. Reluctant respect. Though rarely expressed openly, a form of respect began to emerge within Japanese command circles. It appeared in cautious language, in understated phrasing, in warnings rather than praise. Japanese operational orders increasingly emphasized avoiding direct confrontation with Marine units when possible. Defensive positions were deepened. Tunnel systems expanded. Attrition replaced maneuver. This was not fear, it was recognition. Some post-war memoirs would later reveal what wartime documents only hinted at. Japanese officers acknowledged that Marines were among the most formidable enemies they had faced, not because they were invincible, but because they were relentless, adaptable, and coordinated. The respect was never romanticized. War allowed no such indulgence. But it was real, and it shaped how Japan chose to fight the rest of the war. By the time these assessments crystallized, however, the conflict had already reached a point where perceptions would collide with reality. On islands where the margin between survival and annihilation narrowed to yards of volcanic sand. The moment when Japanese understanding turned into irrevocable certainty was approaching. November 20, 1943. The lagoon off Bitio Island is choked with smoke. From Japanese observation bunkers carved into coral and reinforced with steel, commanders watch the sea erupt. Naval shells slam into the shoreline, tearing apart palm trees, concrete, and men. The bombardment is heavier than anything previously experienced in the Pacific. This is Tarawa. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, Bitio is meant to be a fortress. Its commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, has assured Tokyo that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. His confidence rests on hardened defenses, interlocking fields of fire, and the belief that no attacker could survive long enough on the beaches to organize. The attackers are U.S. Marines. What follows forces Japanese commanders into a final, unavoidable reckoning. Landing craft grind to a halt on coral reefs misjudged by tide tables. Marines are forced to wade hundreds of yards under machine gun and artillery fire. Entire waves are cut down. bodies accumulate in the shallows. From inside the bunkers, Japanese officers believe the prediction is being fulfilled. But the Marines keep moving. Small groups push forward independently. Some crawl, some run, some drag the wounded behind coral outcroppings. Units mix, reform, and continue inland without clear lines or formal commands. Japanese defenders fire until barrels overheat. Positions are destroyed by naval gunfire and close-range demolitions. Marines attack pillboxes from blind angles, using flamethrowers and explosives with brutal efficiency. By the second day, it becomes clear to Japanese commanders that something has gone wrong. Despite catastrophic losses, the Marines have not broken. They are adapting faster than the defenses can respond. Fire control centers are knocked out. Communications collapse. Individual bunkers fight on in isolation, but coordination is gone. For Japanese officers observing the battle's progress, Tarawa is more than a defeat. It is proof. The Marines have endured a level of punishment that should have shattered morale. Instead, it has hardened resolve. Tactical lessons are absorbed in real time. Failures are corrected within hours. The assumption that Americans would abandon an operation under heavy casualties dies on the beaches of Batio. And Tarawa is only the beginning. In the months that follow, Japanese commanders attempt to adjust. Beach defenses are de-emphasized. The goal shifts from stopping landings to inflicting maximum casualties inland. If the Marines cannot be broken at the shoreline, perhaps they can be bled into exhaustion. That theory will be tested in places where the terrain itself becomes the weapon. On Saipan, on Peleliu, on Iwo Jima. Each battle tightens the Japanese understanding of who they are facing and how little room for illusion remains. February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima rises from the Pacific like a wound, black volcanic sand, sulfur fumes, and jagged rock. Beneath its surface lies one of the most elaborate defensive networks ever constructed by the Imperial Japanese Army. The architect is Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. Kuribayashi has studied the enemy closely. He has read the reports from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. He understands that the Marines will not break on the beaches. He orders his men to do something unprecedented. Do not fire on the landing forces. Let them come ashore. When the Marines land, there is no immediate resistance, no fanatical charge, no desperate attempt to stop the invasion at the water's edge. For a brief moment, some Marines believe the bombardment has succeeded. Then the island opens fire. Artillery erupts from hidden positions. Mortars rain down with precision. Machine guns emerge from camouflaged apertures. The Marines are pinned in the open, their movement restricted by soft sand and limited cover. Kuribayashi's strategy is not to defeat the Marines quickly, but to destroy them slowly. This, more than anything, reveals how Japanese commanders now view the U.S. Marine Corps. They no longer expect psychological collapse. They no longer rely on shock or spectacle. Instead, they prepare for a grinding war of attrition, one designed to exhaust even the most disciplined enemy. And still the Marines advance. They adapt to tunnel warfare. They develop new tactics for clearing fortified positions. Flamethrowers, demolition teams, and coordinated assaults become standard practice. When one approach fails, another is tried. There is no retreat. Japanese commanders watch as Marines take ground yard by yard, absorbing losses that would have been considered unacceptable earlier in the war. Kuribayashi's own correspondence reflects the grim clarity of his understanding. He writes not of victory but of delay, not of triumph but of cost. The goal is no longer to defeat the Marines. It is to make the invasion so expensive that American resolve might falter elsewhere. By the end of the battle, nearly all Japanese defenders are dead. Kurabayashi himself dies in the final fighting. The island is taken. For Japanese high command, Iwo Jima is the final confirmation. The Marines are not reckless, they are not soft, they are not dependent solely on machines. They are professional soldiers, capable of sustained combat under extreme conditions, willing to accept losses without losing cohesion, and able to adapt faster than Japan's diminishing resources allow. From this point forward, Japanese planning assumes that any Marine landing will succeed, eventually. The question is no longer if the Marines will take the island, only how long it will take and how many will die doing it. That understanding carries devastating implications, both for the war's final battles and for Japan's future. By the spring of 1945, the cumulative weight of experience had reshaped Japanese strategic thinking. The realization that U.S. Marines could not be decisively repelled altered how Japan prepared for every remaining battle. Defensive doctrine shifted away from dramatic, suicidal counterattacks toward layered, subterranean resistance. The goal was no longer victory in the traditional sense, but endurance, forcing the enemy to pay in blood for every yard of ground. This change was not theoretical, it was visible in the earth itself. Across the Pacific, Japanese engineers carved deep tunnel networks into hillsides and volcanic rock. On Okinawa, these defenses reached their most complex form. Positions were designed to survive bombardment, re-emerge, and continue fighting long after surface fortifications were destroyed. Japanese commanders understood that Marines would adapt, but they also believed that even disciplined forces had limits. Casualty calculations became central to planning. On Okinawa, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and his chief of staff, Isamu Cho, anticipated massive losses, yet believed the scale might influence American political will. The expectation was no longer battlefield victory, but strategic exhaustion. This shift reflected a grim respect. Japanese operational documents now described Marines as methodical and relentless. Instructions warned against underestimating small units. Commanders were advised to expect rapid adaptation to new defensive measures. Yet these adaptations came too late. Japan's industrial base was collapsing. Fuel shortages restricted air and naval support. Communications deteriorated. Experienced officers were irreplaceable. Meanwhile, the Marines were growing stronger. Each campaign refined their doctrine. Amphibious assaults became more precise. Casualty evacuation improved. Fire support coordination reached levels of efficiency unimaginable in 1942. The Corps institutionalized lessons at a pace Japanese planners could not match. The psychological balance also shifted. Japanese soldiers entering battle in 1944 and 1945 did so with a clearer understanding of the enemy, but also with fewer illusions. Many knew they would not survive. They fought with determination, but without the expectation of revering the tide. In post-battle interrogations, surviving Japanese officers spoke candidly about Marine effectiveness. They noted the discipline under fire, the speed of decision-making, and the absence of panic even in the face of heavy losses. These were not admissions meant for public consumption. They were professional assessments, recorded in the language of military reality. As the war neared its end, Japanese commanders no longer asked how to defeat the Marines. They asked how to endure them. That question would echo into the war's final days, and into the reflections that followed long after the guns fell silent. The war ended not with a final island assault, but with silence. In the months after Japan's surrender, surviving commanders were interrogated, debriefed, and eventually left to reflect on a conflict that had consumed an entire generation. In these moments, stripped of ideology and wartime censorship, their assessments of the U.S. Marines became clearer. Many spoke with restraint, a few with candor. Japanese officers acknowledged that the Marines represented a form of warfare Japan had not fully anticipated, one rooted in institutional learning, decentralized leadership, and an unyielding logistics network. Where Japanese forces relied on spiritual endurance, Marines relied on systems that sustained pressure over time. This difference proved decisive. Post-war memoirs and interviews reveal that Japanese commanders came to see the Marines not as individual warriors, but as the embodiment of an organization that functioned under extreme stress. Losses did not halt momentum. Leadership adapted. Doctrine evolved. One former officer noted that Marines did not seek heroic death, yet were willing to die. The distinction mattered. It explained why intimidation failed and why attrition, rather than collapse, defined every encounter. These reflections also carried regret. Several Japanese commanders admitted that early underestimation of American forces, particularly the Marines, had shaped disastrous strategic choices. Had the enemy been understood more accurately in 1941, expectations of a short war might have been abandoned. But hindsight came too late. For the Marines, their reputation among Japanese commanders was forged not through propaganda, but through repeated, brutal contact. Each battle reinforced the same conclusion. The Marines would come ashore, adapt, and advance, regardless of cost. This understanding influenced Japan's final defensive calculations, and indirectly, the decision-making that followed Okinawa. Yet beyond strategy and loss lies a quieter truth. These perceptions, formed in blood and fire, represent a rare moment of mutual recognition between enemies, not of friendship, not of admiration, but of reality. Two military cultures, shaped by entirely different beliefs, met on remote islands and learned painfully what the other truly was. And that realization, more than any single battle, defined the legacy of their encounter. War strips away illusion. In the Pacific, it did so with relentless clarity. Japanese commanders entered the conflict convinced that spiritual resolve could compensate for material disadvantage, and that American soldiers, particularly U.S. Marines, would falter under sustained pressure. Those beliefs did not survive contact with reality. What they encountered instead was an enemy defined not by spectacle, but by structure. The Marines did not fight for myth or ritual. They fought through training, cohesion, and institutional memory. Each battle refined the next. Each loss produced adaptation rather than paralysis. This was not accidental. It was the result of a military culture that valued initiative at every level and accepted war as a problem to be solved, not a test of spiritual purity. For Japanese commanders, this realization came slowly and at great cost. It forced a reevaluation of long-held assumptions about courage, leadership, and what sustained an army in modern war. The Pacific became a laboratory of brutal learning, where ideology met industrialized professionalism and could not prevail. Yet this story is not one of triumph alone. The recognition Japanese commanders developed toward the Marines was born of suffering on both sides. Entire units were erased. Islands were reduced to graves. The respect that emerged was not admiration, but acknowledgement of an enemy who could not be frightened into retreat and who would not stop advancing until the mission was complete. In the end, what Japanese commanders really thought about U.S. Marines mattered less than what the war revealed. That modern conflict rewards adaptability over dogma, systems over symbols, and that the most dangerous opponent is not the one who seeks death, but the one who is prepared, again and again, to endure it. The Pacific War left no victors untouched, only lessons written in ash, steel, and memory.